Maybe you heard the tragic story of the 4 dead girls aged 5 to 16 whose decomposing bodies were found by U.S. Marshals in Washington, D.C. apartment. The mother was arrested for their murders, and 6 public health workers were fired. Kathy Lopez, a social worker for the Booker T. Washington Public Charter School, went to visit the home of the girls when one of the girls failed to show up for school. The mother refused to let Miss Lopez into the home. Miss Lopez became suspicious, called Child Protective Services, asked for an investigation, but nothing was done. She called police department and reported her concerns, but nothing was done, and she was bounced from department to department to department. And it was only when U.S. Marshals was serving an eviction notice that they discovered the dead and decomposing bodies of the 4 girls. According to the NSPCC in the United Kingdom, 58,000 children were abused to the point of needing protective services in 2016. In 2013, which is the most recent data I could find, there were 23,663 sexual offenses against children recorded by police in the United Kingdom. Notice that was recorded by police in the United Kingdom. We have no idea how many went unrecorded. The number of recorded sexual offenses against children in the United Kingdom under the age of 16 increased by 23% between 2005 and 2013. 69 children were murdered in the United Kingdom in 2013. 90% of children who are abused by someone they know, love, and trust. Child abuse occurs in every socioeconomic level, across all ethnic and cultural lines, and with all religious organizations and denominations. Children exposed to violence, like domestic violence, maybe not even perpetrated against them, but the parents who are violent with each other, are more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, suffer from depression, anxiety, and have post-traumatic stress disorder, fail in school and have a difficult time in school, drop out of school, and engage in more criminal activity than children who are not exposed to violence in the home. 1 in 5 children are exposed to domestic violence in the United Kingdom, 20%. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men in the United Kingdom will experience domestic violence, meaning being abused by their spouse. In 1979, in the United Kingdom, 1 in 10 children were born to an unwed mother. In 1979, 1 in 10. In 1988, it was 1 in 4. Today, in the United Kingdom, 1 out of every 2 children is born to an unwed mother. Our talk this morning is entitled, Fix for Failing Families. Families are struggling, families are hurting, and families are in crisis. And this morning I want to share with you some practical steps that can bring healing to our families. Step 1, know God well, His methods and principles. Now this might sound like a Christian cliche, but do we really know Him? 2016 UK government survey found that only 28% of the people in the United Kingdom say they believe in God or some higher power. UK church membership has declined from 10 million in 1930 to 5 million in 2013, as a percentage of the population from about 30% to 10%. And if current trends continue, it's projected that by 2025, only 8% of the population of the United Kingdom will attend church. For those who do attend church, do those who attend church really know God? Do we know His design law of love? Do we really believe God is just like Jesus, or do we see Him differently? Does it matter? Brain science reveals that the God concept we believe changes us neurobiologically. Our wiring of our brain changes. Our love centers grow stronger when we worship a God of love. When we worship a fear-inducing God, we actually become more authoritarian, more self-focused, less loving. Romans 1 tells us that they exchanged the truth of God for a lie and didn't think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God. They even worshipped images made with their own hands. And it says, furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, He gave them over to a depraved mind to do what not ought to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, and ruthless. Wow. See, the mind cannot truly be healed without a knowledge of God. Our families cannot be healed without truly knowing God. 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 5, Paul writing to Timothy says, "But mark this," mark it. "There will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God." But note, having a form of godliness, but denying the power. Paul is not talking about the irreligious and the agnostics and the atheists here. He is talking about the religious people who claim a form of godliness, but they don't truly know God. We have forgotten God, not the idea of God, but the truth about God. God's methods, truth, presented in love, leaving people free, have been replaced with authoritarian God concepts in which God is required to inflict punishment upon those who disobey. And scientific studies show that religiosity, extrinsic rule enforcement, religions are a predictor of childhood abuse. Whereas intrinsic religiosity, developing love and compassion for others, did not predict child abuse. Physical abuse has a negative relationship with the spiritual development in other studies, but a positive relationship with religiosity in rules-oriented Christianity or religions. 2,000 years ago, there was a people on earth looking for the advent of the Messiah. They were a health-conscious people with special dietary habits. They were Sabbath observers. They believed in the Creator God. They were tithe-paying, regular church attenders, sanctuary message believers. But they believed so many lies about God that when He came and stood among them, they hated Him and they killed Him. They didn't know God. They accepted the idea of God, but they didn't know Him. Jesus said at the last days, in the end of time, they will come to me and they will say, "Lord, Lord, we prophesied in your name. We performed miracles in your name. We cast out demons in your name." Notice, Jesus said they'll be doing this in His name, not in the name of Buddha, not in the name of Hare Krishna. They will be Christians. And He says to them, "Get ye hence, ye workers of iniquity. I never knew you." I'm convinced that the number one problem facing society today, the number one problem facing families today, including Christian families, is the truth of God has been replaced with a lie. That we have a form of godliness but no power, because we worship a God who functions like a Roman dictator. It happened in Christ's day. Scientific research demonstrates that religiosity, authoritarian religion, without spiritual development of character, increases childhood abuse, and Christ prophesied it would be this way at the end of time. It's by beholding that we are changed. It's by connecting to God that we are transformed. It's by uniting with Him that we are healed. It's by trusting in Him that we are enabled to love others more than self. Life eternal is that we might know Him, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom He has sent. Our families cannot be healed until we come back to a true knowledge of God. Step 1, we must know God well. Step 2, deal with your own self first. Deal with your own self first. Healthy relationships require healthy people. Doesn't matter how healthy you are. If you're in a relationship with an unhealthy person, you will have an unhealthy relationship. Jesus and Judas, that relationship broke down. Healthy relationships require healthy people, and healthy people are in governance of themselves. Kevin came to see me tearful, anxious, depressed. He wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating, couldn't focus. His marriage of 7 years was falling apart. His wife told him if he didn't get help, she was leaving. He described a marriage in which he worked 60 hours a week or more. When he would come home, he would fall into the lounge chair and watch TV. He complained that his wife, who did not work outside the home, also didn't do hardly anything in the home. She didn't clean, she didn't cook, and he complained. He described argument after argument in which one of them would complain about the other, only to be met with a retaliatory complaint in return. And the house wasn't clean. Meals weren't done. He would nag and gripe, but nothing changed. We explored the principle of healthy relationships require healthy people, and healthy people are in governance of themselves, which means he had the power to change himself. He did not have the power to change his wife. When he realized that, he began to come home earlier. He began to find places he could genuinely show appreciation and thankfulness to his wife and for his wife. He began to speak kind words to her. He would occasionally bring a card or occasionally bring flowers. He took her out to dinner when they could afford it. He began to cook on occasions and clean the dishes. He began to actively seek to make her life better. And soon, after a short, reasonable time of this, he came home and noticed the house was clean and meals were cooked. And she was smiling at the door, waiting to see him. We must deal with our own selves first. Healthy relationships require healthy people. Healthy people are in governance of themselves, and healthy people own their own shortcomings. Stop trying to blame your spouse. Stop trying to blame your children or your parents or your environment. Adam, it wasn't me, Lord. It was that woman. If you didn't put her in the garden, I'd have never done this. Somebody else's fault. During marital counseling with Sue and Bill, Sue disclosed that she had gained over 100 pounds during the course of their marriage. And now she complained bitterly that her husband didn't find her physically attractive. And I said to her very gently, so when you get out of the shower each morning and look in the mirror, what do you think? Oh, I hate it. It's gross. It disgusts me. I said, if that's what you think, why would you expect your husband to see it differently? You see, she was not being truthful with herself. She was very unhappy with her own self, and she wasn't dealing with her own shortcomings. Instead, she was putting them off on her husband. But I said to her, where does your husband go after work? Well, he comes home. What does he do when he comes home? He spends time with me. He rubs my feet when we watch TV. He goes for walks with me. He cooks me dinner. I said, and where's your focus? On the fact that you're not happy with your body, and he isn't necessarily as physically attracted, but yet he still loves you. Do you appreciate his love? Do you enjoy his love? Because she didn't own her own dissatisfaction, she had cheated herself out of enjoying all the love that he was still pouring upon her. We must deal with our own selves first. Healthy relationships require healthy people. Healthy people are in governance of themselves, own their own shortcomings, and communicate well. We must create an atmosphere in our homes where it's safe to speak, safe to be open, safe to have your heart heard, to disagree, to have a difference of opinion. So I'm going to give you 4 quick little steps for healthy communication. Step 1, first, seek to understand before seeking to be understood. Seek to understand before seeking to be understood. Don't be a mind reader. Don't assume you know what somebody else is going to say. Give them the opportunity to disclose. Now think about this. If somebody you care about has an issue with you, they're angry, they're hurt, they're upset, whether it's true or not true, it doesn't really matter. If you love that person and you know they're upset with you, what do you want them to do? Don't you want them to talk to you about it? So that you can work it out, right? Well, that requires you create an atmosphere where it's safe to hear unpleasant things about yourself. There are many people who can't tolerate to hear criticism, so they create atmospheres where people are afraid to come and speak any concern. First, seek to understand before seeking to be understood. So when somebody begins a criticism, instead of immediately going to, that's not true, that didn't happen like that, Instead, go, can you help me understand where you came to hear that? Can you help me understand why you think that? Help me understand why you're saying that. Let them unfold and uncover. And then after they do, next thing, affirm and thank them. Identify and validate. Say, first off, I want to thank you for coming to talk to me about this. I really appreciate you sharing this with me and telling me your heart. And no wonder, validate. No wonder you're upset. I'd be upset too if I thought that's what was going on. And then 3, after seeking to understand, after appreciating, thanking, and validating, then clarify, correct, and explain. You will find they will be much more open to hear. You will get a much more receptive audience. You won't get in the argument back and forth. And then the 4th, sometimes the criticisms are not magnified, they're not distorted, they're not twisted. Sometimes somebody's got an issue with you because you really boofed it. You really made a mistake. And so in those cases, own your own shortcoming. Acknowledge it, you're right, my bad, and specifically ask for forgiveness. Will you forgive me? It's not sufficient to say I apologize. It's not sufficient to say I'm sorry. In a relationship, you must say, will you forgive me? Because now that person has to make a decision. Yes, I will. Or not, and that brings reconciliation. Ron was in his 30s, married for 5 years to his only wife. For more than half his marriage, he'd been deployed to Iraq with his National Guard unit. He had been in combat, seen numerous deaths, had buddies killed and wounded. He was struggling to come to terms with his trauma issues. His marriage was strained. His wife complained that he didn't love her anymore. He would disagree. That's not true. They would argue, you don't love me. Yes, I do. No, you don't. Yes, I do. Nothing seemed to improve. The tensions were mounting. Ron learned to use these tools. Rather than defending himself, next time his wife said, you don't love me, he said, can you help me understand why you say that? And she went on to disclose that since coming back from Iraq, he was distant. He wasn't as affectionate. When she reached out to touch him in the past, he would cuddle up and snuggle up to her. Now he jumps and startles. He doesn't seem to appreciate her touch anymore. And never seemed to relax. He's always on. Once he understood, he thanked her for sharing. No wonder you feel this way. Thank you for sharing that with me. And then he went on to tell her a little bit about his trauma issues that he's working for and clarified that his reactions have nothing to do with lack of love for her, but his trauma issues that happened in the war. And then she was able to understand him and not take his reactions personally and support him as he worked through it. Healthy relationships require healthy people. Healthy people are in governance of themselves, own their own shortcomings, and communicate well. Healthy families require healthy parents, and healthy parents are in governance of themselves. Roger was frustrated, fed up, overwhelmed. At the end of his rope, he came to see me. He had 2 teenage sons, and every day they fought. He and his sons fought, argued, shouted. Roger would give his sons chores to do, but when he'd come home from work, the chores weren't done. He would become enraged. He'd yell and scream. But this pattern never seemed to change. In fact, it was getting worse. He told me how he felt powerless, helpless, and no longer the man in his own home. Roger had forgotten where his real authority rested, in governance of himself. He had forgotten he could not control the behavior of his sons, and in seeking to control their behavior, he actually lost control of himself. We explored that he only had authority to change himself, and so when he would come home and the chores weren't done, he first sought to understand. Can you help me understand, boys, why the chores weren't done today? And on the rare occasion that there was actually a real reason that they couldn't get to them, he thanked them and let either defer till the next day the chores, or would jump in and help them do it. But on the majority of the time, when the chores weren't done and they didn't have an explanation, then he, instead of getting enraged, would express sadness that they had chosen to give up the cell phone, the car, the Xbox, the TV, or whatever other privilege that is for the mature that he paid for and owned. Very shortly, things were done when he came home. Healthy families require healthy parents. Healthy parents are in governance of themselves and remember their responsibilities. And parents, I'm going to shock some parents now. Parents, you are not responsible for how your children turn out. You are responsible for your conduct in parenting. Many parents that come to see me are stressed. They've raised their kids in the church, taught them the Bible verses, went to church school, and the kids, as they left home, have left the church. And the parents look back, what did I do? What did I do wrong? Maybe I should have used real diapers instead of Pampers. I don't know. You see, they've got this promise in their mind. Raise a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. I must not have raised him right. I must not have raised him right. It's my fault. It's my fault. No, that actual promise is mistranslated. There's two translations to that Hebrew. One is the way it's translated. You can translate it that way. But there's another translation that's equally valid. Raise a child according to his way, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Let the child be in charge of his upbringing. Let the child decide what foods, bedtimes, whether they do homework or don't do homework. Let the child dictate their own rearing, and you can be sure you'll get a self-indulgent, narcissistic child, and when they're old, they will not depart from it. This is not a promise you do a good job that you're guaranteed a good outcome. It's a promise if you do no job, you're really pretty much guaranteed a bad outcome. Now, how do we know which is, if it can be translated both ways, how do we know which is really the true way? Well, we have to look at case evidence. The case of a perfect parent who makes no mistakes of any kind, i.e. God parenting Lucifer, God parenting Adam and Eve, did that guarantee they got good outcomes? So it cannot mean if you do a perfect job, you get a perfect outcome. It has to mean the other. Parents are responsible for their conduct in parenting, not how their children turn out. There are many variables besides your input that will affect their impact on, I'm sure you hear the stories, children who were molested by a coach that was well vetted and you had great trust in, because they don't broadcast if they're a child exploiter or abuser, do they? Could be a coach in a church school. Could be a priest. Do you think if your child was exploited in that way, it could affect the outcome of their life? Is that because you did wrong and failed to be a good parent? No. Many things can affect the outcome besides your parenting. We are responsible for the choices we make in governance of self, in parenting, not how things turn out. Also, parents have the responsibility, or are not responsible, to be their child's friend, buddy, or getting their child's approval, but for doing what's actually in the best interest of the child, regardless of what the child thinks. Example, getting your child vaccines. The child may not really understand what's going on while you're holding them and a doctor jabs a needle in their leg. The child may think, why are you doing this? Don't you love me? Why aren't you protecting me? Do you wait for the child to comprehend and understand? Or do you do what's best for the child even when they don't? John couldn't understand why his son was always in trouble, truancy, vandalism, marijuana, shoplifting. But John described a lifelong inability to set boundaries with his son, to discipline him for fear that his son might not like him. John was desperate that his son love him and like him, and he couldn't tolerate his son's rejection of him. And so he never set a boundary with his son, at least not without his son's approval. You won't be mad with Daddy if Daddy puts you in timeout, will you? Healthy parents do what's right because it's right, not because the child will approve. Healthy families require healthy parents. Healthy parents are in governance of themselves, remember their responsibilities, and healthy parents are united in love. United in love. Don't allow the children to split you, which requires that the parents have to communicate well. If you see your spouse making a discipline error with one of your children, you don't correct your spouse in front of the children. You call your spouse into a private room, you give them the information that they're missing, and let the one who made the error go out and correct themselves. Sheila was 35. She came to see me. She was anxious, depressed, overwhelmed, stressed, sleep problems, inability to focus at work. She was married to her second husband and had 2 teenage sons in the home from her first marriage. She described how her husband would discipline her sons, but she would object in front of the boys. She would tell him to back down, or she would stand behind him and shake her head or roll her eyes as he tried to discipline the boys. And her family was in constant chaos, constant turmoil, constant upset. She came to see me overwhelmed and stressed, and I explained to her the principles of healthy families require healthy parents, and parents are united in love, and how she had been undermining her husband behind the back and shifting authority to the boys and causing and contributing to this chaos. She understood and accepted that and went home and confessed to her husband what she was doing and committed to stand by him in a unified front with those boys. He was immediately relieved with such relief and such stress because he was so frustrated and was so thankful to her that he became less desperate and less irritable and calmer in his demeanor. And when the boys realized that mom really was going to stand with dad from now on, their rebelliousness and unruliness settled down very quickly. Parents, you must remember that in a home, especially with young children, you represent the Godhead to your children. They will invest you with omnipotence at a certain age. You're all-knowing and you're all-powerful. And the reason they do this, it's because without that, they're frightened. They're fearful. They can't handle where the food is going to come from, how the bills are going to get paid, how they're going to keep people from breaking into the house. They don't have to worry about that because they have an all-powerful mommy and daddy who will look out for them. It's important you remember this because the devil wants to split the Godhead so that we see the Godhead not as united, not as one, but as diverse gods. Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit come into unity of love, and as they do so, they create. And God created man and wife to come into the unity of love, and as they give of themselves in love, they procreate beings in their own image. We are very godlike in the powers He's given us, and we be united in love as we exercise those powers. But Satan wants to split the Godhead. He wants to split your family. He wants to split our view of God so we see one God as an authoritarian rule enforcer, and another God as a merciful, self-sacrificial being who tries to protect us from the rule enforcer. Don't let your home function that way. Parents, be united in love. Discipline in a united front. Healthy families require healthy parents. Healthy parents are governance of themselves, remember their responsibility, are united in love, and healthy parents set healthy boundaries and enforce the boundaries they set. I'm going to give you a never. An absolute. Never set a boundary you're not willing to enforce. Never set a boundary you're not willing to enforce. Here's why. Imagine your child is maybe in first grade and they're taking, learning to spell words. And they got a spelling bee coming up. And you tell your child, if you study real hard and get 100% on the spelling bee, I'll give you a 5-pound note. They study really hard. They come home 100%. And you don't give them the 5 pounds. What did you just teach them? You taught them something very important. That you lie and you cannot be trusted. Didn't you? Now you tell your child if they don't pick up their toys before dinner, they can't have dessert. Comes to sit down, mealtime, we sit at the table, toys are still out on the floor, meal's over, it's time to serve dessert. You put one at every place, but you don't put one at their place. But they begin to cry and wail and make a fuss, and you go, okay, you can have dessert this time, but next time pick up your toys. What did you just teach them? That you lie and you cannot be trusted. If you don't enforce the boundaries you set, you're teaching that you don't keep your word and they can't rely on you, they can't trust you. And you will get chaos in your home because they will increase their anxiety, will make them feel unsafe, they'll begin acting out. You see, the boundaries you set provide safety and structure and security. Maybe some of you remember your infant newborns. Your infant newborns, if you want to get an infant newborn to settle down and go to sleep, what do you have to do? You have to swaddle it. If you don't swaddle, if you just throw a blanket over, they'll cry and kick. As soon as you swaddle them, they'll tug for a minute, and then they'll settle down to sleep. You see, an infant was in a nice, warm space, closed, limited environment. And then suddenly, in a very traumatic way, they're blown out into the world. And there's way too much information for them to process. The world is way too big. It's scary. And so when you swaddle them, you've reduced, that's a boundary. The blanket is a boundary. It reduces their world down to something that makes them feel safe. And as they grow a little older, they go from the blanket to your arms. And as they go from your arms a little older to your presence, and you'll see little children, they'll go run, but they'll come back and touch, and they'll go run, and they'll come back and touch. And then very shortly after that, it's the rules. And when you set rules and you're consistent with your rules, that becomes a constant, stable worldview for them. And so if you have a rule, don't go out and play in the street, and you're reliable, and you keep your word, and you enforce your boundaries, that rule to the child's unconscious mind says that the world can't come into my yard and hurt me. So they feel safe in their yard. But if you're not consistent, if you're unreliable, if you don't keep your boundaries, it would be like this. Have you ever seen a checkerboard tile floor? Looks like a checkerboard tile floor. Imagine that you're going to have to walk out on that floor. Some of those tiles are on concrete and will hold your weight. Some of those tiles are just spun sugar. When you step on, you'll fall 50 feet onto spikes. But you have no idea until you make the step. How stressful will you be to walk out on that floor? When you're an inconsistent parent who doesn't enforce the boundaries you set, the child has unpredictability. They don't know. They don't know where they can place their step. They don't know what action they can take, and life becomes constantly fearful and constantly stressful for them. So they begin acting out, trying to find some place where there's consistency and predictability. When you set your boundaries, until they learn that you're consistent and reliable, they will always test them. When you swaddle the infant will test and struggle and then settle down. When you set boundaries, they'll test the rule. Are you going to keep it? Because they're looking for consistency. They're looking for trustworthiness. And you, as a parent, are responsible for keeping your word, for being trustworthy. And children in the room, if there's any children in the room, I'm going to tell you a secret, children. Your parents have as their number one goal to parent you in such a way that one day they can quit parenting you. Am I right, parents? Yes. So if you want more autonomy and more freedom, all you have to do is fulfill all of your responsibilities completely and fully now. Keep your room clean, your bed made, do your homework without being told, be where you're supposed to on time, all the time, reliably. And if you're that kind of a child, you will get more freedoms. But if you love the parents up in your business, then don't meet your responsibilities, and the loving parents will restrict your freedoms because you can't handle the ones you have, and they're going to try to give you an environment with less demands until you can meet those responsibilities. Step 1, we must know God well. Step 2, you must deal with your own self first. Step 3, have a vision. Have a vision for yourself, a vision for your family, a godly vision, an eternal vision, a vision to be like Jesus, to be the healthiest, most Christ-like wife, husband, parent, or child through God's grace you can be. Have a vision for your children, a vision to see them become like Jesus in character. Set as your number one goal in parenting to influence your children to become like Christ in character. Not to get A's, not to get rich, not to get recognition, not to get gold medals, not to get blue ribbons, but to become like Christ. Number one. We all too often mistakenly put our number one goals as getting ahead, success in the world, promotion of self. Some years ago, Sports Illustrated took a poll of aspiring Olympic athletes. 198 sprinters, swimmers, powerlifters, and others were asked to answer 2 questions. First question, you're offered a banned performance-enhancing substance with 2 guarantees. You will not be caught, and you will win gold in your competition. Would you take it? 195 said yes. 3 said no. Second question. You're offered a band performing enhanced substance with 3 guarantees. You will not be caught. You will win every competition you enter for the next 5 years, and you will die from the side effects. Will you take it? More than half said yes. Parents, we have a problem. We too easily take our eyes off Christ and set an earthly vision. Getting good grades, first in contests, winning at all costs, self-promotion, self-exaltation, self at the center. Make Christ-like character your number one goal. Step 1, we must know God well. Step 2, you must deal with your own self first. Step 3, have a vision, a godly vision. And step 4, create an umbrella of love and live under it. See everything through the eyes of love. A member of my Bible study class some years ago said in class, "My wife's not perfect, but I know she wants to be. I know she loves me so much, she never wants to come up short. She never wants to make a mistake. She always wants to be perfect. So because I know that, when she makes a mistake, I already know that she's grieving in her heart, and her heart is sad that she couldn't have done it better at that time. And so I'm not upset with her." And he went on to say, fortunately, I'm not perfect. But I love my wife so much, I want to be. I never want to come up short. I never want to disappoint her. I never want to let her down. And she knows that. So when I do, she's not mad at me. We must create an umbrella of love and live under it. How do you experience those in your family who make mistakes? Have you ever been on a ball team, or do I have to say cricket team? You ever been on a team, and maybe you had somebody on the team who wasn't very athletic, kind of awkward, but their heart was 150% for the team. They tried harder. They came earlier. They stayed late. They worked, but they were still the weakest member on the team. What was your attitude to that person? Have you ever had somebody on the team that was just an athletically gifted person, but when they messed up, you were pretty certain they were doing it on purpose to throw the game? That they had a bet on the other team. How's your attitude toward that person? When somebody in your family makes a mistake, do you view them as the one who's trying with all their might to do their best, and their grief and their heart's broken when they come up short, or do you view them as somebody who's throwing the game? We must know God well. We must deal with our own selves first. Have a vision, a godly vision, and live under an umbrella of love.
You pray.